Hello, thank you so much for joining us. Just to quickly introduce myself, my name's Robbie and I'm the Schools and Youth Outreach Officer at Hope for the Future. Basically, I lead on all of our engagement UK-wide with young people and teachers. And it's an absolute pleasure to be introducing you all and bringing you along to our Seen But Still Not Heard Voices on the Youth Climate Movement mini-series. So far, we've had well over 100 sign-ups. So along with yesterday, today, and the two remaining events for the rest of the week, we're looking forward to having lots of different and dynamic discussions. So just to give everybody a bit of a quick overview as to who Hope for the Future is. So Hope for the Future essentially is a UK climate communications charity. And we work across the country equipping communities and individuals with sort of the skill set that they need to effectively engage their local politicians on climate. And we feel that, this is something that's vitally important, especially right now, as we're beginning to build back better from the coronavirus crisis and ensuring that the economic recovery aligns with our path towards reaching net zero by 2050. I mean, hopefully earlier. And further, that we believe that, local grassroots democratic engagement is an essential part to achieving meaningful, long-lasting climate action. So this is the fourth instalment in our wider webinar series, Common Home, Common Ground. And we'd like to really thank the European Climate Foundation for funding our entire events project, which has allowed us to bring these webinar series to you. And then personally, I'd like to thank the Oak Foundation and ECF again for supporting our youth and schools work throughout the previous, this and next year. So just a bit of housekeeping then before we start. Firstly, this webinar will be being recorded, so it'll be available on demand for you to watch again and share. And I'd really encourage everybody to share this webinar so that the conversations we have here extend beyond just this space. And then further, it's been live streamed today on Facebook and YouTube. So again, interact and share with that where possible. And then, finally, at the end of this webinar mini-series week, we'll be sending lots of emails directing you to further webinars like this, resources from Hope for the Future and our speakers. So Clover, if there's anything you want to share, do give me a shout and we can get that shared. And then that way, these webinars will become an encouragement for people to take climate action beyond just digital spaces. So let me introduce our brilliant speaker. Today we have the absolutely fantastic Clover Hogan, 21-year-old climate activist, researcher on eco-anxiety, and founder and executive director of Force of Nature. So in 2019, Clover launched Force of Nature to mobilise emerging leaders through thought leadership, in-school programmes and targeted campaigns, working across the world to really help young people overcome their feelings of powerlessness, realise their potential to inspire change, and encourage action on climate. So Clover, if it's all right, I'll pass over to you, give you the floor for 10 minutes to tell us a little bit more about yourself, your work, and then we can follow that up with some questions. And just, thank you so much for taking the time to join us, especially from the States. So I'll hand over to you.
Absolutely. Well, first off, thank you so much for having me. I know I have 10 minutes, but I'll try to spare everyone the life story. But with that, I'm from Australia originally. I grew up in tropical North Queensland. And why that's important is that I grew up fishing frogs from the toilet bowl and dodging snakes that hung from the ceiling. So all of the rumors that you hear about Australia are absolutely true. And growing up immersed in the wild and the wonderful instilled in me a really deep-seated appreciation for nature. And, a dad who's a botanist, a mum who's a personal development coach, I was kind of the lab experiment of both of those things. So when I was 11 years old, I started watching documentaries for the first time. And that was really my catalyst for launching into this world of environmental activism and climate campaigning, because I had the rug pulled out from underneath me. I came from this really protected, incredible environment to suddenly realizing the extent of exploitation on the planet, the extent of harm inflicted on people and animals. And I watched An Inconvenient Truth by Al Gore, and I'm like, okay, great, I've just been born into this world. We have maybe 20 odd years to change every part of how we live, breathe, and exist to deliver a better, brighter future and avoid climate collapse. So for all of those reasons, decided to become an environmental activist and really felt this this pledge to be a voice for the voiceless. And so when I was 13, managed to coerce my parents into leaving Australia and moving to the heart of the Indonesian jungle so that I could attend a place called the Green School, which is wall-less bamboo classrooms. And for anyone familiar with the Steiner model, it's a little bit like that on steroids. So it's all about learning by doing. It's how, instead of studying math from a textbook, we would, go down to the local river, design a bridge, build that bridge with the local community and turn it into a self-sustaining social enterprise. Or classically, we read Lord of the Flies in year 8, and the teachers didn't stop the lesson there, though. They took us to a deserted island and basically let us play it out to see how we would develop social contracts. So it's an incredible, incredible learning environment, but most importantly, as much as I felt at home in the jungle, it was my launch pad into the world. So it's where I started working with the United Nations and where I started really developing this passion for persuading people in positions of power and for igniting the passion in otherwise calcified leaders who weren't waking up to the urgency of the issues. But when I was 16, I had my second kind of aha moment. So I was at COP21 in Paris, the annual climate agreement, and I was in conversation with a lobbyist. And having up until that point, worked in the world of grassroots activism, I was very connected to my impact. But for the first time, I was in a setting, in a structure that was highly bureaucratic, that was very much, political niceties and tinkering around the edges of the problem. And I felt this physically crushing sense of powerlessness. And I really appreciated the weight of being, one person in, 7.6 billion. And I had this aha where I was like, okay. So the greatest threat we face isn't the climate crisis, but our feeling of helplessness in the face of it. And, by that point, I'd been researching climate change for a long time. I was familiar with many of the solutions. And as many of scientists would say, we have all of the solutions for the climate crisis. We have the technology. In theory, we have all of the resources, all of the money, all of the man and woman power. What we're lacking is the tenacity, the uncompromising resolve, the society-wide mobilization that is going to enable us to deliver on that better, brighter future. And so that was when I really had this obsession ignited in me to understand how to most effectively mobilize mindsets and how to shift people from a place of anxiety and overwhelm to a place of agency and empowerment. So my first job out of the jungle was at Impossible Foods in Silicon Valley, which is the company that makes meat from plants. And that was a really, really interesting one because I got to work with the CEO and founder, Pat O'Brown, on designing national youth strategy. How do you change the perception of vegetarianism? How do you market a product that looks, tastes, and bleeds just like the real thing, but enables you to do something that's good for yourself and good for the planet? There was a great crash course in how to communicate on these issues in a place of invitation, and that's what I love about Hope for the Future, right? It's not how to kind of badger people into doing the right thing. It's how to invite them toward a better way of being. And then from there, kind of was thrust into the world of sustainability consulting and working with multinationals and how to think about, change at that level, where smaller changes can have really, really big impact across supply chains, et cetera. But consistently, back to this point of powerlessness, I experienced it both working in classrooms with 11-year-olds as I did, working with the C-suites of some of these huge companies. And we have a tendency, I think, to assume that, people in those positions of power are both cognizant of what they're doing and know what needs to be done and feel, the agency to do it. But in all of my experience working with big companies, there is a lot of positive intention, but they too feel, well, I'm just one in 7.6 billion people, or, the system is too broken to create meaningful change. So for all of those reasons, started Force of Nature last year. And as you mentioned earlier, our mission, our mandate is to really support, empower this emerging generation of leaders to realize their change-making potential. And we know that that starts with mindset. We know that it starts with clarity of cause, taking ownership of a problem, whether that's prison reform or microplastics, but it's also getting clear on the stories that limit us from claiming that future, from being custodians of that future. And so we're really the experts in understanding what some of these stories are, how they manifest, and how we can begin to rewrite them. So that's a little crash course, a whistle tour through what we do and how we've kind of landed here. And increasingly, you know, really recognize the importance of doing what you're doing and being able to articulate what it is that we're actually working toward. And I think, you know, that's one of the big challenges with the sustainability space, is that for so long we've defined ourselves based on what we're reacting against, that perhaps we've forgotten to take pause and think about what it is that we're actually working toward. So beyond being able to articulate, you know, what's stopping you from more meaningful engagement with the issues, beyond getting that kind of clarity of where you want to create change in the system, it's, you know, just as critical that we do have that vision that we're working toward as well. So yeah, really delighted to be joining today and to unpack some of these topics with you, Robbie.
Yeah, that sounds absolutely amazing. I think like the, you know, sort of the beginnings of your life and what motivated you to become involved in climate action is really, really quite inspiring. Quite an interesting story, quite unique as well. I know that for me, it was something that my family are the most politically engaged from the north of England. And so it was something that I discovered myself coming to uni. And like you, I get the privilege of working with lots of inspiring young people in school. And I don't know if you share this experience, and some of the people watching this might share that experience. But what would you say to, you know, young people who, like you touched on earlier, have this feeling of powerlessness, have these fears and hopes for the future, but, you know, they might not have necessarily had, whether it was, you know, the tools from their family to become involved in this sort of space or whatever. What would you say to them young people who have these really, really quite rational fears, but, you know, don't feel equipped to get involved and don't feel like this might be a space for them?
Yeah, so I have a few answers to that question. So, you know, having really dived deep into the stories that limit us from taking action, that, you know, kind of enable our inaction or facilitate our climate denial, there is one that comes up consistently with young people, and it is that I am not experienced enough or I'm not talented enough. And I think it's also reflective, obviously, of this culture of social media, right? Because when I go on my phone, I go on Instagram, I'm seeing a rose-tinted window into everyone's lives, right? And it creates and facilitates this comparison culture. And it also applies to the change-making space. You know, a lot of young people I've spoken to, worked with, have said, well, I'm not Greta Thunberg. You know, I could never do what she does. Or, you know, it's this kind of disavowal, right, as we say in psychology. So it's misplaced responsibility. You know, it's not up to me. I don't have the talents, the expertise. It's up to someone else. And what I would say is that, you know, the world has only ever been changed by people who have had the naive optimism to go out and change it. You know, and I think young people, without maybe realizing it, bring an exceptional set of characteristics and skills to the table that many of the business leaders of some of those powerful companies in the world do not have. And for young people, it's the energy, it's the ability, unencumbered by, you know, being jaded by the systems that many older generations have helped create. You know, a sense of optimism of what is possible, and imagination is really, really critical. It's, you know, a willingness to make mistakes, and it is this kind of uncompromising resolve, which comes, I believe, from a place of sort of moral absolutism. So, you know, as we get older, we become more and more complacent toward all of the kind of wrongdoing in the world and, you know, everything that isn't working. And we forget that these are ultimately stories that we've learnt and grown up with, and mythology in our society, you know, that numb ourselves to this hyper-globalized, consumptive kind of society. But a young person emerging into this sees it for what it is, sees that it is a story, and realizes, driven by the urgency of the climate crisis, that we have to rethink so much of how we live, breathe, and exist in the 21st century. So there is a great capacity for determination, a great capacity for imagination, which is really, really critical in this. And so, I would also say that for a long time, climate has been spoken of through a really narrow lens, and it's the fault of the environmental movement, 100%. It's been very much relegated to like polar bears and solar panels. But I think as we appreciate that the climate crisis is the symptom of broken systems, from the clothes I'm wearing to the food in my fridge to the products in my home, we realize that each of us has an impact, and with that, each of us has a role and each of us has a responsibility. And I would say that, the flip side of how much we've kind of messed up the planet is how many ways there are to help it. So no matter your curiosity, your passion, your area of intrigue, there's a way for you to make a really meaningful difference. So, I've worked with, a young girl who is really passionate about fashion, right? And, we look together at the fact that the textiles industry is responsible for, over a third of microplastics, which was the problem that she was really passionate about. So it's always coming back to, how do I bring together the thing that really triggers me and that upsets me with where I'm uniquely placed to show up to solve that problem. If you're motivated by your gut, how do we change the fact that a third of the world's food is wasted every day? Or if you're really passionate about social justice, right? The climate crisis will not be solved without centering people in that discussion and centering people as the custodians of all of those solutions. It is about rewriting social contracts. It's about racial justice, right? It's about redesigning a centuries-old system of oppression and subjugation of communities of color. So, no matter where your area or your sweet spot, there's a way to create a really meaningful difference. And I would finally say that I think, the way that we're sold activism is really problematic. In the broader context, for a long time as individuals or consumers, we've been told that the best that we can do to take on the climate crisis is change out light bulbs, right? And I find it really insulting, especially when it's, people expect that the best that young people can do is, go and banner ablaze in the street, right? It's all of these micro activations are super important, but actually each and every one of us is capable of showing up to solve a problem in a much bigger way, in a way that has resounding impact. And getting clarity on where that place is, getting that focus, is how you go in to have that impact. So, young people have so much potential, creativity, imaginative spirit, and it's actually critical to being able to solve the climate crisis. We won't be able to do it without this intergenerational collaboration.
Yeah, I think that's like a really important point, that intergenerational collaboration. It really is an intersectional issue. And I really, really like the point that you made about, within activism, you don't have to compare yourself to other people. It is really relative to the capacity and resources you have. And equally, this point about, whether it's the 11-year-old girl that you're working with that really cares about fast fashion and framing climate change as something about, how she can change fashion, and that's going to contribute to the climate crisis. And equally, I found that, speaking to people about cars, for example, they might not be interested in some of these bigger issues, but then when you bring it down to cars, electric vehicles, then they're like, oh no, that's interesting, especially young people. They might be like, oh, I want the new Tesla if it's electric vehicles or whatever, you know what I mean? And that this whole idea about framing and really knowing your audience is something that we really, encourage people to consider at Hope for the Future. And we use a quote when we're supporting people engaging with their elected representatives, that designing a love letter without your audience in mind is like writing it, is like addressing it to whom it may concern. And, it's about really, really speaking to your audience. Which brings me to my next point, really, about, you've defined this role and about what young people can play in sort of activism space, let's call it that, and what they can do, sort of thing. And yesterday we were speaking to young people, and we had some members of parliament and some local elected representatives on about the impact that young people can have on their elected representatives. And I don't know if you know, but today there's a virtual mass lobby of the UK Parliament and government going on called the Time Is Now lobby. So I was wondering, have you ever engaged like formally with any of your elected representatives? How did that engagement go? And what would your tips to young people be, who might not feel or have the confidence to do that?
That's a really good question. And I would admit that for a long time, I was kind of scared too. And I think that was because I'd experienced the sort of bureaucracy of, working within the UN and working with elected officials in that capacity, that I was like, that's not my space. And I would say that, I've definitely tried to play to my strengths, and I've engaged less with politics, because I think it's just a very potentially slow moving way to push forward change. But that said, we see the power of when elected officials step up in a really meaningful way. And we see the power of what happens when we create those spaces for intergenerational exchange between young people and between those who are ultimately there to serve your needs. And I think that's really important, is that, politics is something that we've grown quite complacent toward, and we've sort of accepted a level of corruption, a level of lying, a level of misinformation, that it's very easy to kind of assume that, okay, it's too hard. Someone that we interviewed on the Force of Nature podcast recently, Marcus J. Ball, he's the private prosecutor who prosecuted Boris Johnson following the Brexit referendum for lying to the people. And it was fascinating talking to him, because I was like, how on earth did you have both the courage and tenacity to take on something that so many of us have just accepted, right? And he said, ultimately, that person there in that elected, position of power, they want you to think it's too hard. They want you to disengage from the process, right? They don't want you to question what they're doing. They don't want you to question their supposed truths or facts. But when you do, you can push forward incredible change. And that's what we saw with Marcus's case, right? It made headline news, the fact that someone had the audacity, right, to take on someone who was otherwise deemed untouchable. And it also pulled the rug back on, the corruption within that system, and how problematic it is, and the institutional reform that is required to change politics in the UK and beyond, in all kind of global democracies. And so with that, I think you have to have the courage to engage. You have to take on that responsibility. I think for a long time, and this has been a really big wake-up call for me as well in the context of Black Lives Matter. I come from a place of privilege, a privilege that has allowed me to disengage from political discourse, because I've never been as aware as, my friends of color, of the direct impact of certain policies in the present moment. Climate is often talked about in a very far off kind of future context, but the policies that we choose today, the people we elect today, will have impact for generations to come, and are already impacting communities right now in the UK. So we each have a responsibility to step up. Finally, I would say that, again, back to this idea of how power plays out and how change happens. Some of the greatest change happens around the dinner table, right? And that's when young people have conversations with their parents, with the older generation, and very candidly ask, what is it that you're doing about climate change? Those conversations are incredibly powerful, and they need to leave the dinner room table and come into these places of where decisions are made. And, the people in power are ultimately there to serve your needs. As much as they might be seen to be serving their own agenda, they're ultimately there to respond to the demands of the public. Now, we see what's possible when not just you as an individual are able to step up, but when you're able to step up in collective. For example, the third runway at Heathrow. Or the expansion plan at Heathrow, that was something that was seemingly set in stone. And yet when certain politicians came into the picture, we saw the incredible change that was able to happen. And we were able to actually overhaul that particular decision because young people demanded that change, and because they had the courage to kind of engage in those conversations. So yeah, I mean, it's definitely not my area of expertise, but it's something that I'm appreciating I have a responsibility toward. And one particular campaign that I think is really exciting is called Teach the Future. And that's really how to write education reform so that climate change is at the heart and center, and so that young people are equipped both with the knowledge and also the skills and tools to be able to solve for the crisis. It seems absolutely crazy that it's not already written into curriculum, but this is a really awesome initiative to make sure that that happens.
Absolutely, and I would echo that sort of positive message about Teach the Future. We've worked with them before, and I think they're an absolutely fantastic group of people. Campaigning for something really, really important, and it's a bit of a why is that not already there sort of thing. And the thing that I really like about Teach the Future as well at the moment is the way that they're framing their arguments about this need to rebuild towards a better society. And there's lots of things that have been going on for years and years and years. Whether it's to do with racial injustice globally, whether it's to do with the climate crisis, and I think that everything right now has just been highlighted, and this world that we're living in right now is really, everything's got a spotlight on it. And that brings me to my next point about how we come out of the crisis that we're in and prepare for going into the next sort of crisis. How do you think we can do that in a way that leads us to a future that's fairer, greener, sustainable? And is there anything that you're doing? Is there anything that you'd encourage people to be doing right now to get us to that place? I know that Force of Nature is currently doing the online program, so if you could tell us a little bit more about that, that would be brilliant. Because hope for the future, we're doing a slightly similar thing in that it's more encouraging people to get involved politically and contact their elected representatives. So finding more information about that would be absolutely brilliant.
Definitely. Yeah. So I think it really draws back to this piece around mindset. So, we often talk about what are the tools that we need to navigate this uncertain future. And I think, if anything, COVID has offered a small glimpse into the chaos and disruption that is to be expected with climate breakdown and ecological breakdown. And, I had a conversation on the podcast recently with Fahana Yaman, the incredible environmental lawyer who has been at the top tier of climate negotiations for over 25 years. And, I asked her, I was like, what degree of collapse is inevitable? And she said, absolutely none. If we have societies, if we have communities that are designed with people at the heart of them. A hurricane that hits a community that has proper infrastructure, that has systems of support, that looks after people, that makes sure no one is left behind, the damage is ultimately going to be minimal. Whereas you look at that same hurricane falling on a community that is poorly equipped, where you don't have access to education or healthcare or a medical system or any of these basic needs to ensure we live in a just, thriving society, the outcome is going to be radically different. So that's why we often talk, in the context of climate change, about this idea of resilience. How do we design communities where we look after one another? One of the leading causes of death, beyond smoking, beyond alcohol abuse or anything else, is loneliness in Western culture, right? It's people being completely isolated, right? And so as we talk back to this idea of climate being the symptom of broken systems, we need to rekindle our communities. We need to rekindle those social contracts to be able to deliver on that better, brighter future. And I believe that does begin with mindset, 100%. And so, we've recognized that there is this kind of explosion of mental health difficulties in young people around the world. COVID is an exacerbator, but much of the research shows that the climate and ecological crisis is actually one of the leading drivers, if not the leading driver, of anxiety, of overwhelm, of lots of young people kind of sort of unsubscribing from society is the only way I can think to describe it. It's like, so I've talked to 12-year-olds who have said, well, I'm not going to go to university because what's the point, if there's no planet, right, for me to have a career on? Or, I've spoken to a 14-year-old girl who said, I'm not going to have children, the birth strikers movement, right? I'm not going to have kids because it would be irresponsible to do so. And so we're seeing the direct impact on young people and their mental state of well-being. And that's why so much of what we do at Force of Nature is around how to facilitate the shift from anxiety to agency. So in the present moment, you can do the thing that solves the problem that you care about, that puts you in a place of empowerment to take action and to take ownership and responsibility, but also so that you are resilient in times to come. And when we look at the research, when we look at the science, that future can seem pretty darn scary, right? And it's especially scary in the context of our lived experience right now, when we have polarization, when we have people reverting to the ego and individual. It looks like a radically different future, again, if we have those social contracts and if we have those community bonds. So really, that's our area of obsession, is how do you really instill a set of mindsets and belief and expectations that set people up to be resilient and to have clarity and to not default to the worst parts of our human nature, which is kind of what we're encouraged toward all the time, whether it's on social media or it's through the education system, which teaches us to become highly competitive and see ourselves as a set of averages. How do we shift that mindset so that even in the face of the worst adversity, we're able to be our best selves and we're able to support those around us? So our recent kind of project that we've launched is a set of online classrooms, which we're so excited about. We had 50 signups in under 24 hours, young people from Marrakesh in Morocco, through to Istanbul, through to South Africa, to Tehran, to Indonesia, all of whom identify this anxiety about climate within themselves, and all of whom want to shift into a place of agency and empowerment. So we just started our pilots last week. We're running 4 more classrooms over the next couple of weeks. And they're really, safe spaces to be able to kind of connect to our feelings, talk about our anxieties, talk about our pressures, and then think about how we can proactively channel much of that energy into proactive action. And really that's about identifying where you want to create change, whether that is lobbying for policy change, whether that is at the grassroots, whether that's going in, leading within an amazing organization. The options are absolutely limitless. And in fact, a number of the young people who've already gone through the program have decided that politics is something that they do want to take on, and have proposed some really cool ideas around how to target elected officials, especially in this country. And I think it instills me with such hope to see that young people are willing to take up that mantle, even though it can seem so dark, and even though it can, it's hard to see light amidst what's happening currently, especially in this country, or any country led by a tyrant, I suppose. Bolsonaro in Brazil, Boris Johnson in the UK. I think it's amazing that in spite of the lack of leadership and the negligence of our leadership today, young people are willing to step up and take that upon themselves. It's really, really incredible.
Equally, yeah, I think that's absolutely inspiring, and I'm really looking forward to see sort of the results of these people that are going to be going through the Force of Nature programs. And these themes of courage and resilience, they've come up quite often in this conversation, and also in the sort of pre-submitted questions from sign-ups and the audience. And one of the questions that we've had come up quite often, which I'll move to now, is about how to communicate the challenge of climate change and the need to take action to friends and family, and having the courage to do that and assist them with that. Because I don't know about you, but as a young person, quite often I find that whilst, sometimes I'm in this space where I'm caring about climate change, some of my friends who might have other priorities, it might not be their number one thing. Quite often it's quite hard to encourage and bring people along to take the action that needs to happen. And equally with my family, I won't make a lie about it. Not everybody in my family is as passionate as me about politics and climate. And sometimes it can be a bit, here he goes again with these whatever about climate and whatever about politics. Just get it over with. I'll vote the general election maybe, and then I'm moving on. That's fine. That's all done for me. So what would you say to people? Because I suppose there's the courage to speak into an elected representative, and I feel like once you've got the skills to do that, and once you've got the confidence to do that, and you can persist with that, whether it's the example you gave or the young people that I work with or whoever's doing it around the world, I think, engaging with somebody that has the power to do something politically, once you've got the skills, you can find it quite easy to do that sometimes. But, challenging your friends and challenging your family can be quite daunting. And I think that, you know, what do we say to these people who really need to be challenging and having these conversations? What would you say?
Yeah, great question. So I would start by saying that it is really, really important to vacillate between two spaces. So the first space is where you build up your tribe around you. They're the people who get it. They're the people who are going to back you. They're the people who help you solidify what you believe in and really help serve as that kind of launch pad to make you that much more effective and ambitious and whatnot. They're really, really important because they're going to nourish you. And to use a really overquoted phrase, it's like, if you want to run quickly, run alone. If you want to run far, run with other people, right? So it's really important that you build up that team, that community. And having that foundation is what's going to enable you to engage with the people, with the audiences who might have radically different opinions, who might not seem to care about, you know, what your thing is, your mandate, your mission. And it's going to enable you to do that for the long term. What I would say, you know, by way of advice in terms of how to communicate to those different audiences, is to really understand what it is that they care about. So we have a tendency, and I think this is a natural evolution of activism as well. It's like, oh, wow, I've had this great aha, this awakening. I care about this thing. I see it as clearly as night and day. And then you leap from that place to, oh, well, why don't you get it as well, right? Like, why don't you understand why I'm passionate about this thing? And everyone's going to have their catalyst for a different reason. You know, everyone's going to care about climate for a radically different reason. So it's all about tailoring that to your particular audience. And I would use an example from my personal life. You know, my first kind of act as an environmentalist was to go vegetarian. And I did it for deeply personal reasons. I did it for ethical reasons. And, you know, it was quite a funny decision in the context of my family, because my dad is French and he's a chef. So for me to become vegetarian was like a rejection of everything that he stood for. And for the first few years, it was really, really difficult because he didn't get it. Every dinner conversation was a debate about this particular topic. It was like this horrible shadow in our family, and we were constantly butting heads. And that was because I was arguing from my standpoint, he was arguing from his, and there was very little willingness, I suppose, or appreciation of what it meant to understand the other side, right? I'm even doing it now. It's like polarizing language, but understand where that person was coming from. It wasn't until I started working at Impossible Foods that I was able to communicate to him in a much better way about this challenge and why it meant so much to me. And that was because beyond being a chef and French, my dad's also a botanist and he cares deeply about plants. And when I started working at Impossible Foods, I was able to equip myself with the knowledge of the research and statistics around the impact of the animal agriculture industry on our environment, on our most precious ecosystems. And once I could speak in a language that he understood, you know, not one of ethics and morals, which can be really slippery and is always going to be subjective, but to that place of, you know, reason and rational thinking, he got it completely. And for the first time, we were able to have meaningful conversations and not from, you know, not defined by our politics or our opinions. And I think so many conversations today, you know, that's the first foot that you put forward. It's not appreciating the similarities that you share with that person you're trying to persuade or have a conversation with, but it's, you know, this, I am, you know, my opinion, I am my perspective. So understand what it is that that person cares about. And no matter their politics, background, experience, there's always going to be something. And back to this point of, you know, climate change for so long has been communicated about, you know, polar bears and solar panels. And I had an experience working in an underserved community in the UK last year, and there was a group of girls in the back corner and who clearly were not interested in what I had to say, and I got that, right? Like, they were chatty in the back and they weren't engaging. I was like, okay, let's go over and figure out what's happening. And, you know, being London girls, they did not hold back. They kind of turned to me and they're like, how do you expect us to care about climate change when every day we experience sexism, racial discrimination, religious discrimination? These are girls who had come from Nigeria, from Kenya, had immigrated into the country. You know, how do you expect us to care about these things? I was like, that's a completely valid point, because I'm coming from the perspective of why I care about these things, and I'm not experiencing the inequalities that you do every day as a result of my own privilege. And so we then engaged in a really open, honest conversation around climate. And we talked about the fact that, you know, climate, one of the most effective solutions ever proposed for reversing global warming, for drawdown, being able to pull more carbon from the atmosphere than we emit, is educating women and girls, right? It's providing women reproductive rights, providing women autonomy of how they spend their money, ensuring that girls are able to get an education, whether they have a $10 uniform or not. And once we talked about it from that very human perspective, once we talked about it from the context of opportunities that they had been extended in their own lives as a result of being able to, you know, have an education in the UK and have these different opportunities, they completely got it. And as a result of that conversation, two of the girls turned around and said, we want to go home, you know, back to our home countries once we've graduated, and we want to start schools. You know, we want to figure out how we can provide curriculum to girls, you know, who haven't had our opportunities. And so, you know, every conversation has to be from that context. It's all about painting a vision of a future that people can plug into, and recognizing that that is not one singular future, it's a multitude of different futures. So how are you going to help that person you're trying to influence realize their potential through that kind of journey?
Yeah, that was really, really brilliant and very, very interesting to hear. And I think that, you know, this whole idea of humanizing conversations is really, I think, the key to solving any social justice or any sort of social issue that we find ourselves wanting to tackle, especially climate. I know that, you know, the example you gave about you and your dad was something that, like, I've experienced myself with talking to my parents. Not convinced them to become vegetarian yet, but I mean, meat-free Mondays is something that's becoming a bit more common. And I mean, like I said earlier, it is really all relative. And, you know, you touched on this idea of speaking to these young girls who are, you know, and it's something that I've experienced a lot, is when young people are saying, I've got this to worry about. And it's so true that, you know, yet to be activists, as I like to call them, these people who, you know, like you say, just need to realize their potential and remove this feeling of powerlessness, you know, will move on to become activists. But I think equally there's something to be said about activists who are already very much putting a lot of time and dedication into seeing, you know, whether it's climate change, whether it's women's rights, whether it's whatever, people are putting a lot of the energy and time into things. And one of the questions that, again, has come up so often is, how do you, as somebody that, you know, is so passionate about all these things and dedicating so much of your time to advancing these causes and other people around the world, what tips would you give to them to just check yourself? You know what I mean? Just check yourself. Just make sure that you're doing all right, and make sure that, you know, your mental health is as good as the people that you're trying to win over from the other side, as you said earlier. So how do you deal with that, and how can we encourage other people to take care of themselves and avoid burnouts, which is very, very common in our sort of space?
Yeah, it's a great question. So in addition to running these workshops and online classrooms for, you know, young people who are just kind of emerging into the space, we recently did a session with young climate activists in the UK who've already been part of many of these movements for, you know, over a year, maybe a number of years. And what was really striking was that so many of them were on the edge of burnout. And if anything, said that COVID was like this kind of moment of much needed pause, where they could kind of nourish themselves and take a bit of a break. And I think that's what's so difficult, right? And, you know, young people naturally, I think we're a little bit more impatient. We want change to happen right away. We're really, really feeling the burden of the scale of these challenges. You know, you go online, you're constantly being fed, you know, doomsday news. You're constantly being fed a narrative of how, like, small you are in the face of these problems and how, you know, disempowered you are. So for all of those reasons, it's like the perfect storm to reach burnout, right? And to do everything that you can on this kind of hamster wheel that never feels like it's enough. And I think that's why it's really important that we shift from this narrative of, being one person who changes the world, being the superhero who saves the day, to realizing both that change takes time, and that to be effective, you mustn't carry the weight of the world on your shoulders. And this is something that I've really grappled with, having come into this space at a really early age, at 11. So much of my identity is wrapped up in climate change and activism and being a change maker, whatever that means. And having recently turned 21, I've kind of had to unshackle from even that youth activist label, right? So we subscribe to all of these different stories about who we are. And one of the most effective things that I found in my experience for my mental health to make sure that my activism is sustainable is to relinquish attachment to outcome and to relinquish expectations. And I have a friend who works as a campaigner, and he had some really good advice on this, because he had worked on helping a number of politicians in the US get to power. He'd been their campaign strategist. He'd, for a number of cases poured, over a year of his time and energy just getting this one person to take that seat or to take that position. And, oftentimes over 50% of the time, they didn't reach that goal, that specific goal. Now, that could come across as really, really crushing, right? You're investing so much in this particular outcome. And then fundamentally, what happens at the end of the day is outside of your remit, right? And he said that as a result of working in this space, his definition of success changed significantly, which was, it wasn't about that end goal. It was about the change that you enabled along the way. And I think it's the same in the climate space. I've seen burnout from so many young climate activists who, in the wake of protests, have felt really powerless because the particular change that they were lobbying for, or the particular elective that they were lobbying to get into power, didn't eventuate, didn't happen. And then somehow internalizing that as a personal failing. And, that's so much of how our education system is designed as well, right? Like, you're a good student, you succeed if you get that particular letter grade on an exam. It isn't about, whether you became a better person in the process, or, whether you were kind, or, all of the little wins that you might have had every single day. So we need to shift that narrative. And it's really critical for our mental health, because the reality, as difficult as it is with climate change, is that we might fail, right? Like, we might in the next 10 years exceed the climate tipping points that scientists tell us will put us on a path of irreversible climate change, right? Where natural systems basically take over and no amount of human intervention is able to stop them from accelerating. That is a potential eventuality, right? And if I wrap my sense of self, my sense of success up in that end goal, it's going to completely debilitate me. But if I instead wrap my metric of success in the actions that I take every day, in the way that I choose to lead my life as a good person, I hope, if I choose to reflect that success in acting, even knowing, which I think is that much more, just and inspirational, I suppose. If I choose to act knowing that I could fail, I've done the right thing, and that has to be enough. That has to be enough. And so each and every one of us, I feel really needs to come from that perspective of acting. And it's probably another overused, I love overused inspirational quotes, but Mother Teresa said, I might build my house and that house might get blown away tomorrow, but I'm going to build anyway. And it's the same thing with climate. We have to build anyway. And part of ensuring that our activism is really nourishing and that we're able to do it for the long term is not coming from this place of a savior complex, not coming from this place of I'm going to fix all the problems and I'm going to save the world and I'm really noble for doing it, but because we enjoy it and because we know it's the right thing to do and because it gives us that sense of purpose and fulfillment. So long as we're always checking in with ourselves to make sure that we're grounded in that, we're grounded in a reflection of who we were yesterday, not comparing ourselves to who someone else is today, then we're going to be this in for the long run, and hopefully we can actually create the kind of communities and society that we want in the process.
Yeah, equally. Like, that was very, very interesting and brilliant to hear. And I think that myself, I resonated with a lot of what you just said. And because when you do enter the space, I know that when I entered Hope for the Future, I was like, I work at a climate communications charity, I'm going to change the world. And then you realise that actually Parliament, gets dismissed. We have general elections, then we have coronavirus, and then we have X and X and X, and the fragility of climate change just becomes absolutely clear because it's constantly up and down the political agenda and social agenda. So I think that is a really, really important message about it really is one step at a time. And, if you don't get the thing that you wanted to do, if you don't achieve that overarching big goal, that doesn't necessarily matter because at least, you've put the effort in, you've tried and you've made some changes along the way. And I think, going back to this quick point of the fragility of the climate agenda, which I'm sure probably frustrates you as much as it does me and many other people. Obviously, 2020 was sort of touted and expected to be this year of amazing climate action with COP26, which is, meant to be, is now postponed until 2021. So one of the questions, again, that has popped up, probably because of your experience of attending COPs and having this knowledge and understanding about how COP works, what would you sort of say to people who are, frustrated that COP is postponed until next year, and what would you say they can do to get involved to try and make COP a success, and what would you say a successful COP would look like? Because as you said earlier, the next 10 years is an absolutely critical point in the future of this planet, and COP is a huge part to play in determining how the next sort of decades are going to play out.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think I would first reflect that, one of the big failings of COP to date is that it has been allowed to take place in closed door rooms. And it's still been embedded in this mindset that, a group of, particularly powerful people are going to kind of write the economic model and then go and give it out to the masses to implement. And we realize that change needs to happen in a fundamentally different way if we do want to deliver on that future. Fahana, who I mentioned earlier, the environmental lawyer, she in many ways, among with some other incredible trailblazers, is attributed for achieving COP21, which was the most historic climate agreement to ever pass, when for the first time in history, we had world leaders coming to the table and saying, we're making a commitment, we're all signing up to this agreement in the interest not just of our little country, but for the first time in the interest, of the world, right? Society, the globe, the planet, the pale blue dot. So she was there, she orchestrated much of that agreement, and yet she's now working entirely at the grassroots. So she's still engaging in some of those conversations, but she started something called Think and Do, which is all about how to center climate in community, right? And how to make sure that this is a conversation that exists at the dinner table, at the societal level, right? That isn't some weird thing that happens over there in some country and, it's all very Illuminati and mysterious, but how do we ensure that that these big decisions about our future, about our world are happening, on the bus, that are happening, at the picnic table, whatever. And so, Think and Do is all about driving solutions from, the life that you're leading right now. It's based in Camden, and it's all about how to take back places and spaces, within the city of London, so that people have an opportunity to really crystallize the future that they want to work toward, to really begin to shift this narrative of the future being something imposed on me by politicians or business leaders or whatever, to something that I have control over, and that's something, again, as we were talking about, I can get a lot of fulfillment from delivering on. So I think we're seeing this space this closed space begin to dissolve a little bit, and there's more of this kind of peering behind the curtain. And from COP25 last year, it was equal parts frustrating and inspiring. Frustrating in that I dipped into the room at one point to listen to the resolution, and for the 10 minutes I was there, they were arguing over a single line of text, and how that was articulated in the context of us having a decade to reverse global warming. That was quite a startling realization that we were getting caught up in the way that bureaucracy facilitates. The flip side is that I did go to a panel session between the CSO, so Chief Sustainability Officer of Coca-Cola, and a young climate activist. And she knew her shit. I'm not sure if I can say that word, but she cut through all of the BS, right? And she just laid down the facts and said, you know, you're kind of spinning a pretty tale about what Coca-Cola is doing to do the right thing. But please explain to me then how you've justified depleting water tables in India for the past, 40, 50 years. Please explain to me how you justify not changing your supply chain so that people are, reimbursed for, good work. Please tell me how it is that you haven't phased out plastic bottles and that you don't have a closed loop recycling system, right? She just literally rapid fire listed all of the things that they were failing to do to step up to the challenge. And, he didn't know what to do with himself. He was completely caught off guard by it. But it was this, real breath of fresh air, because for the first time it was, we weren't having the conversations that people wanted to hear. It wasn't just blatant greenwashing. It was, a young person having the courage, having the audacity to just ask the questions that we all actually want to know the answers to. So, a successful COP for 2021 will be exactly that. It's where we invite a diversity of voices, where it doesn't exist in a silo, where it's a society-wide mobilization, and where it's it's not one pivotal point, but it's one of many. And potentially it's the crescendo, potentially it's one step of a much bigger journey that is going to involve each and every one of us, no matter whether we're corporates or politicians or whatever. So that's, I really feel, what needs to happen from like a policy standpoint. COP21 back in 2015 was really significant, but because lots of countries, or many countries for the first time in history, kind of signed up to the ambition of trying to keep emissions within 1.5 degrees of warming. And yet in many ways it wasn't ratified, right? We saw Donald Trump, the moment he got into power, basically say, well, I'm not a fan of that, so let's sideline it and let's dismantle it. So an effective COP will be countries showing up to not just make empty promises about the future, but actually show how they're already reversing warming, and grounded in targets that are not able to be dismantled by individuals with their own agendas in power, to ensure that we do keep within 1.5 degrees of warming, and that it is the top priority for all politicians, for all world leaders, because the moment we shift from short-term vested interests to the long-term gain of the future it is that we want to inherit, that we want to pass on to our kids, we're going to come out with a radically different outcome. So I don't know if that's naively optimistic, but there are lots of things to give me hope. Young people engaging in the conversation is one of them, and we each have a really critical role to play, whether that's sat at the event itself, which I'll admit is actually quite boring most of the time and really isn't all that exciting, or it's doing something in our neighborhood, starting a grassroots movement from our backyard, which is in the capacity and capability of each and every one of us. We all need to show up in our unique ways to take on climate in an exciting way.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really powerful message again. And, this idea that real social change really isn't possible unless top-down and bottom-up processes really do run parallel to one another. And yeah, if there's anyone watching in London, Camden, do check out Think and Do, get involved with them. That sounds absolutely brilliant.
Yeah.
And just one last question, then I know it's approaching 3, and we could probably talk all day about lots of different subjects, but just one last question. Tomorrow we're going to be talking to Sheenie McDonald from Christian Aid, Maya Rose Craig, aka also known as Bird Girl, and Vanessa McCarthy, about inclusivity and diversity in the climate movement. And we've touched on, bits throughout this conversation about this idea of priorities and why it might not necessarily be a priority for somebody, despite the fact that, the impacts of climate change are disproportionately felt by, marginalized communities, minority groups, and things like that. So is there anything that you would like to add on that and say about how we as a movement can become more inclusive and diverse, and what we should be saying to our friends who need to be involved but might not necessarily are involved? And then we can finish, and I'll let you enjoy your day.
Yeah, absolutely. So there was a really great question that was posed at an event that I went to last year, or it was a bit of a reframe, and it came from Abigail Disney, who's kind of inherited the Disney empire and is doing what she can to center inclusion and diversity in her mandate and her mission. And she said, you know, in every room that you walk into, ask who isn't there. And my reflection, having quote unquote kind of like owned up to this youth activist label, is that I would often enter rooms about how to engage young people in the climate crisis, about how to empower and support our generation, where I would be the only young person, like the only person under the age of maybe like 35, 40. And I'm a young person who comes, you know, be the first to admit, comes from a place of enormous privilege. You know, I realize that I am where I am today because of the family context that I come from, you know, being extended every opportunity, being supported every step of the way. You know, I have no excuses not to kind of be where I am right now. And so, you know, there are so many young people who are excluded from those conversations. And they're young people who, frankly, are potentially much better positioned to solve many of these problems because they've experienced many of the challenges that we need to be able to solve to effectively take on the climate crisis. And we talked briefly about, you know, climate change being symptomatic of a centuries-long history of, you know, commodification, not just of the environment, but of people, of exploitation, of a system of white supremacy that is based on the oppression of, you know, communities of color, of voices from, you know, the global South. You know, it's really, the way that we talk about climate change is really indicative of this exploitation and neglect toward the diversity of voices, because we often talk about it as a future problem, right? Politicians continue addressing it as a future challenge, a challenge to face future generations, whatever. And of course, you know, this 10-year period is really critical about, you know, which trajectory we do end up on. But that is to ignore and neglect the fact that there are young people already experiencing the direct impacts of the climate crisis right now. There are children in the Maldives who are losing their homes because of rising sea levels. There are girls in Bangladesh who do not have access to education because they can't afford a $10 school uniform. There are indigenous communities in the Amazon who are having their lands taken away from them because Bolsonaro is giving license to illegal loggers and traders. And so there are people all around the world right now experiencing the incredible, you know, astronomical impacts of this crisis. And we have a responsibility, each and every one of us, coming from a place of privilege. If you are white, if you come from, you know, a middle class background, any of these kind of tick boxes, you have to take it upon yourself to be a voice for the voiceless and to ensure that those spaces open up for other young people. And you know, Vanessa is a great example of this. Last year from the World Economic Forum, you know, there's a photo of these climate activists, and as you know, she's cut out of it as a girl of color. Now, there was no good reason, absolutely no justification for that, but it's a tiny token example of a much deeper seated history and experience of racism for many people around the world today. And so long as we continue to talk about climate change as energy solutions and in the context of polar bears and relegating it to the world of quote unquote environment, you know, we're not going to be able to effectively solve it, because even if climate crisis wasn't happening, we were in a pretty dire situation already, right? And that is, solving that problem is not about, you know, saying I'm an ally on Instagram. It's not about, you know, posting a black box, right? It's saying I'm willing to do the work. I'm willing to put the hands in the mud, and I'm standing there alongside you, and I'm going to support you. And having been a beneficiary of such privilege and opportunity, you know, I'm going to step back so that you have access to opportunities that I would have otherwise. And that's something that, you know, I've come into awareness with and been doing much more recently when I'm on panel sessions or talking about climate, always making sure that it's diverse and inclusive. And if it's not participating, because every time you do participate, you're enabling that problem, right? You're enabling that behavior. So we need to continually check ourselves. I understand when people do live in a place of ignorance, it's really easy, especially in the age of social media, to exist within your own narrative and to say, well, it's not really up to me, it's not my problem, it's not my experience, but actually it is. If you care about having a livable planet, if you care about having a livable future, you're going to step up for the people who don't have the opportunity to. So it absolutely needs to be at the center of every conversation about climate, every solution. And I'm really, really excited to see your webinar, because it's such a critical issue. And yeah, encourage everyone to go and check it out, because we each have a role to play and there's always more that we can be doing.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that. And just to quickly add, I'm sure that you'll agree with this. One of the things that you touched on then about being the only young person in the room, I know that we'll discuss lots of stuff about diversity and inclusivity in terms of non-sort of age-related issues tomorrow. But one thing that I think is really important as young people that are coming into this sort of space and coming into any sort of profession really is that the quote that I always live by and a quote that I've been told quite often is it's important to be the first person to do it, but make sure that you're not the last. So I think that the young people that are listening to this, you know, that if you are somebody that's been employed by a campaign group, if you are somebody that's coming into a new organisation, bring other young people along with you. Don't, you know, don't you be the only young person in there. Make sure that you're empowering your friends and other people and bring them along with you. But yeah, thank you so much for coming and joining with us today. I know that you're probably incredibly busy with all the stuff that's going on at Force of Nature. Do send us that across and we can help promote that and get people involved for you. But yeah, like I said earlier, tomorrow we'll be joined by Sheena McDonald, Maya Rose Craig and Vanessa McCarthy. So please do tune in for that. And yeah, if you want any support or help or guidance in you know, contacting your elected representative, whether it's at a local or national level, do get in touch with us at Hope for the Future. And if there's any more burning questions you've got around eco-anxiety and turning that anxiety into agency, then pop over to Force of Nature and I'm sure that they'll be absolutely delighted to help you out with that. But yeah, just finally again, thank you, and please do stay in touch, Chloe. The work that you're doing is absolutely necessary to achieve the action that we need, and I think you're doing a brilliant job. It's really, really inspiring. So yeah, thank you so much for contributing today.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Robbie. And yeah, best of luck with the rest of the series.
Brilliant.